because I got the awesome room with all the food and drink. So feel free to make yourself comfortable. If you want a scone while I lecture, you're welcome to get one. I'm Jamie Poissant. I teach an MFA program at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. I teach fiction writing there. And this is my second year teaching the Clarksville Writers Conference, so I'm happy to be back. And even though I'm sure I won't get your names today, hopefully I'll have them by tomorrow, but just real briefly, if you want to, we'll just go around and you tell me your first name, and since we're talking about writing, maybe tell me the name of a favorite author or book, or just the last good book you read or what you like. And so we'll start at random.
Try to do that. James Patterson, but not the intense. My name is Shirley Howard, excuse me, and I'm a fan of James Patterson, but not the intense, more the juvenile reading, things like that, like Maximum Ride, things like that. And I'm also currently reading 7 Days in Utopia. Wonderful book.
Pat Holler, I've recently read Eli the Good by Silas House.
Oh, I love Sarah.
Bill Skeely, I sort of like John Updike's last book that he did toward the end of the times.
Ainsley Besser, Larry Brown.
The last book I read was by James Joyce, the artist of a young man. It's kind of tough, but that's what I'm working on.
My name is Mary Nell Wooten. I can't even tell you the name of the last book I read. And I read very often, several a week, but just
Joe, I teach introductory writing in college at Baymar Institute. It used to be Adronis Junior College. Favorite writer, Alexander Pushkin, a Russian poet, and I enjoy writing. I have one book of poetry published.
I'm Gina, and my favorite author is Clarksville.
I'm Tristan, and my favorite book is Blood Meridians, but I'm halfway through The Sun Also Rises, and I'm really liking that as well.
My name is Chase, and my favorite author is Billy Collins.
I'm Kara. I recently enjoyed Cormac McCarthy's The Road and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
I'm Jim Power. My favorite author is James Lee Burke, but I just finished William Gay's The Provinces of the Night. It's a very good read.
And he'll be here. So.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you can hear her, it's fantastic.
My name's Gabby Jones. My favorite author is Mary Higgins Clark.
My name is Will, and my favorite author is Richard Bausch, and probably the reason I want to be a writer as well.
I'm Dan, and I guess I don't really have a favorite author. I'm more of the how-to kind of guy, so I'm reading the how-to stuff that's out there, the business-related books. When I read for entertainment, it's how to do stuff. So I'm the boring guy. But
well, this whole conference is a how-to, so
yeah.
I'm Danielle, and I read a lot, but I'm currently rereading My Sister's Keeper for like the 1000th time. I love Jacob Foley.
My name's Tommy Youngblood. I don't really have a favorite author. I like the short stories like by Clyde Edgerton and Flannery O'Connor. So, things about the South.
My name is Susan Newsom, and the last book I read was Living History by Hillary Clinton.
My name is Rusty Smitty, real name Russell Ann, Scottish. And my favorite fiction writers, or my favorite books of fiction are Faulkner's As I Lay Dying and Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose. And I'm currently reading an autobiography by Keith Richards, Alive, I think. it's called, I'm not sure, and one by Allen Ginsberg. And my favorite, when I discovered Robert Frost's long narrative line poems, when I was a child, I fell in love and wrote poetry. And but one of my favorite authors currently is Becky and Fritz Goldberg.
I'm Jim Marshall, now once again a Clarksville native. The book I've enjoyed the most in the last year or two was Flannery, and partly because there was so much information in there about how Caroline Gordon influenced Flannery O'Connor. And for those of you who don't know, Flannery O'Connor, Caroline Gordon and Ellen Tate, their house is just down the Cumberland River, high up over the old bridge. It's called Ben Folly. So if that's not on the information, if you have a car, you ought to drive over there and see it.
And again, I'm Jamie. The last great book I read is a story collection called Birds of America by Rory Moore. And if you get a chance to come to my session tomorrow, we'll actually be looking at a story from that collection, kind of dissecting it and talking about how we build a story. But I'm really happy to be here. I love being in the South. I grew up in Georgia. My parents had a house about 10 minutes from Andalusia, Flannery O'Connor's childhood home. And it's great being in a conference like this when you hear Clyde Edgerton and Larry Brown and Flannery O'Connor and Dick Bausch's names pop up, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm in the South. Like, you guys read, and you read well, and this is fun. So, but what I want to talk about today is writing at the sentence level. So my whole thing today is just surrounding this one thesis, which is really simple. And that's the takeaway. So if you take one thing away from this today, it is my belief, and I think a lot of writers believe, that every word matters. There's lots of great writers who write really good stories, and then there's lots of writers who write really great sentences. For me, personally, the best writing is from the writers who can tell a good story, but they tell it in a way where every sentence that you read is just one of those whistle sentences where you read it and you're just like, man, I wish I could write that well. The most important thing to think about as we talk about this, and I'm sure a lot of you are already published, a lot of you are writing all the time, and that's great. So this is nothing new to you. But keep in mind when we talk about this, I don't mean that as you write in your first draft, every sentence has to be good, because of course it won't be. If you look at the first drafts of any published writers, they're probably abysmal. There's nothing they want anyone to see, because writing is revision. I would say, at least 90% of writing is revision. It doesn't happen, or it rarely happens that it all spills out and it's this like beautiful vomit. No, it's just vomit. It starts as vomit, and then you have to get your fingers in this. I'm not going to continue this metaphor. It's gross. But whatever you want to go with there, you really have to dig in and spend some time. And it's in the 19th or 20th draft, or if you read a writer I really admire, like Charles D'Ambrosio, for him it's the 79th or 80th draft of a story, which is why I think he's had 2 collections in 15 years. That's where the writing gets really good. So I want to just start with a sentence, and we can look at why every word matters. So someone give me a short 5 or 6 word sentence. Let's go with the standard subject, verb, direct object. It can be anything. Someone doesn't give me an idea, I'm going to go with more vomit.
The bear is very large.
Okay, the bear is very large. Do you have one also?
I was just going to say, Tommy took the violin out of the
Okay, good. So let's work with that one. All right, so we have a story. We have our subject, Tommy. We have his action, took. We have the direct object, violin. So we're taking the violin out of the case. Now, there are a zillion ways to write this sentence. And you think, well, why does it matter? This sentence does the job. Okay, good, yes. So in your first draft, if you're writing a story about Tommy, it doesn't matter who Tommy is or what the violin is all about for the purpose of this sentence. But for the purpose of the story, you're going to be wanting to think about a lot of different things, like tone, mood, character, point of view. All these things are going to influence how we write the sentence. So, what's another way we can state this sentence? Lovingly. Okay, good. If we want to add some sort of emotion. Tommy lovingly took the violin in that case. That tells us something about how he feels about the violin. But say we decide that this sentence is too long. There are ways we can trim it. What if we don't want to say he took the violin out of the case? Out of. It's kind of wordy. What's another way we could put that?
Remove.
Yeah. So took is a verb, but it's a pretty weak verb. So let's sort of build it into a slightly stronger verb. He removed the violin, and then we can say from the case. All right, so we've already taken a word out of our sentence. We're shorting it. And because every word matters, economy, and we're not talking about the debt ceiling here. What I mean by economy is shortening and strengthening. The less words you can put in a sentence, the stronger it becomes. And you may say, well, I really like a writer like Cormac McCarthy, who has these long, lush sentences, and I do too. I love Cormac McCarthy, I love Faulkner. But they're able to have long, lush sentences where every word still matters. So in a sentence like this, out and of aren't words that matter. So if we can cut one out and substitute it for a word like from, we're making the sentence more efficient. So we can say Tommy removed the violin from the case, but we don't always have to just keep it in this subject, verb, direct object order. We could say that the violin was removed by Tommy. And that's passive voice, and that's kind of clunky, and that doesn't sound very good. So we might like the fact that the violin comes first. That tells us something about the tone of the scene. And so then we might come up with a sentence like, the violin was in the case. Tommy removed it. So you see how just turning that one sentence into two sentences, it changes the tone of the moment. It's kind of like in a film, where instead of just having a scene of someone opening the case and pulling the violin out, we get a close-up on the violin, and then we get a close-up on Tommy taking it out. All right, again, just very slight changes, but I think it changes the way that we read the story. This is all kind of abstract, so let's put it into a more concrete terms by looking at some actual story beginning. Where the sentence level, I'd argue, matters most is at the beginning of the story, because when you're sending a story out and you're trying to get it published, often the editors will read the first few paragraphs, and if those paragraphs don't grab them, they're not going to continue reading. No matter how good that story gets or how devastating it is at the end, you really want to make sure that your tightest prose is at the beginning. So let's look at the beginnings of these stories and see how some of these writers are writing at the sentence level, where they're making every word count. This is a story, Marie, by Edward P. Jones, author of Lost in the City and The Known World, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Fantastic writer. Let me just read the first paragraph, then we can talk about what he's doing. Every now and again, as if on a whim, the federal government would write to Marie Delaveau Wilson on one of those white stampless envelopes and tell her to come into their place so they could take another look at her. They, the Social Security people, wrote to her in a foreign language that she had learned to translate over the years, and for all the years she'd been receiving the letters, the same man had been signing them. Once, because she had something important to tell him, Marie called the number the man always put at the top of the letters, but a woman answered Mr. Smith's telephone and told Marie he was in an all-day meeting. Another time, she called and a man said Mr. Smith was on vacation. And finally, one day, a woman answered and told Marie that Mr. Smith was deceased. The woman told her to wait and she would get someone new to talk to her about her case, but Marie thought it bad luck to have telephoned a dead man, and she hung up. Now, years after the woman had told her Mr. Smith was no more, the letters were still being signed by John Smith. Come into our office on 21st and M Streets, Northwest, the letter said in that foreign language. Come in so we can see if you are still blind in one eye. Come in so we can see if you are still old and getting older. Come in so we can see if you still deserve to get supplemental security income payments. She always obeyed the letters, even if the order now came from a dead man, for she knew people who had been temporarily cut off from Social Security for not showing up or even for being late. And once cut off, you had to move heaven and earth to get back on. Okay, so a lot going on in that first paragraph, or those first 3 paragraphs. First thing I want to talk about is point of view here, because that's so important to a story like this. So real quickly, just this will be a review for most of us, but what's the first person point of view? I, yeah. Okay, it's the first person pronoun is I. Generally the protagonist of the story is telling the story. Second person pronoun is you. Good. So kind of rare, but you will see novels like Jane McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City, or a lot of Lori Moore's second person stories. It's kind of a trend in the 80s. Probably though, what you're going to see most commonly is third person, which is that he, she, or it voice. And so this is no exception. It's a third person story from narrator's point of view, but the narrator is very close to Marie. So what you have to understand about third person is there's a lot of different types of third person. There's what we call the omniscient narrator. Okay, this is the kind of all-knowing, omniscient God who, this is the Joyce. This is the writer paring his nails in the next room. And then there's a close third. And when we get a close third, we have what we call free indirect discourse. But we'll just call it close third. And what free indirect discourse is it's when, yes, we have a third person narrator, but it's almost written as if you are reading a first person narrator. So the third person narrator's voice is taking on the qualities of the main character. Does that make sense? So let's look at this and see how Jones is using the free indirect discourse here. Every now and again, it's kind of when the federal government people would write to Marie Delaveau Wilson. Those people have titles. Okay, they don't go to work and they say, "Hi, I'm federal government person number 1." The reason he says the federal government people isn't because Edward G. Jones is lazy and didn't want to look up the titles of the people who work in an office. And it's not because he is an omniscient narrator who's making a mistake. It's because he is in the close third viewpoint of Marie. No, we're not reading a first-person story, but we may as well be because this is a really third close person. So we know that when she thinks of them, she thinks of them as those federal government people. Later, she talks about how they tell her to come to their place. Okay, she doesn't name the building until later on. She doesn't give us the address. She just says that place. Again, the Social Security people, they write to her in a foreign language. So all of these words are important because it's getting us into the mind of Marie Wilson. We have to understand that she doesn't quite understand these people. She doesn't understand how their jobs work. All she understands is that she gets these letters that are hard to decipher and she obeys them. She chooses the word there, obey, because if she doesn't obey, then what happens? Yeah, she loses her benefits. She's elderly, she's blind in one eye, so we can surmise that she probably can't work and she needs this money to survive. It's probably the only income she has coming in. So it's very important to her. And this is a great way to start a story because really, I'm going to erase a little bit here. All the plot is and I did a session last year, if you were in it, forgive me for the redundancy. But all the plot is what a character wants versus the roadblocks to get to what that character wants. All right, so in this story, now there's going to be, it's a long story, it's 20, 25 pages, and as we go along, we're going to learn more about the character, her past, her history, her friends, her children, and there's more to it than that, but really what's driving the whole narrative is that this woman wants to get her Social Security paychecks, and she's not getting them, and so she has to go back to the office and go back to the office, and each time there's some new reason why she's not able to get the money that is owed to her. That's telling a story. Right? You can tell a whole story. What is the Odyssey?
It's a journey.
Yeah, it's a journey. It's Odysseus wants to get home. That's it. He gets home, kills a bunch of people, and it's over. Now, a lot of stuff happens along the way, but you never lose sight of the fact that he is trying to get home. So anytime in your first paragraph, if you can introduce something, the reader will feel that you're a confident writer and will trust you because they know what they're reading the story for. If you go on for a page or two with sort of a lot of summary, with a lot of introductions, no matter how good your sentence is, how lush your description, how beautiful, often a reader's going to get impatient with you because they'll think, this is beautiful, but what am I reading for? We all want to know when we start a story what's going to happen that will tell us the story is or isn't over. Okay? Spider-Man. It will be over when he does or doesn't defeat the Green Goblin, right? We know that as soon as we see the Green Goblin. And that's just basic way we tell a story. If you don't know what the end is, then probably need to either write until you have a sense of the ending and then get there, or don't start writing until you have a feeling of what the ending is. I mean, I guess what I'm not saying that you shouldn't, I'm not saying don't write if you don't know what the end is. I guess what I mean is the whole time you're working, even if you're writing to discover the ending, you've got to keep that at some part of your back burner of your brain, that I'm writing for a reason towards something. And if you never get a sense of what that's toward, you're just going to keep going and going and going. So we also have a use here of really beautiful repetition on that second paragraph. It says, come into our office at 21st and M Streets Northwest, the letter said in that form which, come in so we can see if you are still blind in one eye. Come in so we can see if you are still old and getting older. Come in so we can see if you still deserve to get supplemental security income payments. Again, we're writing at the sentence level. This isn't an accident. Why choose this section, this information, to use that sort of repetition?
It's frustrating. Sort of builds tension.
Yeah, it builds tension. It's frustrating. Why else?
It emphasizes repetition.
Yeah, the language itself mimics the action. Every few months she has to come in, and so we've got language that mimics the action of what's going on. Come in, come in, come in, she hears, she gets in the letters, and that's what she has to do. One thing we're going to talk about at the end is some tricks to watch out for in your prose, and one thing I'm going to say is that you want to watch out for cliches, but one of those cliches might be moving heaven and earth, but I'm going to argue that in this case, when she says, and once cut off, you have to move heaven and earth to get back in, why might that be a useful use of cliche?
Because that's what she would say.
Exactly. If we had an omniscient narrator who could choose to state the Tommy violence sentence in any way he or she wanted, then you might look at that sentence and say, well, that's kind of a lame sentence. Anybody can come up with that. The reason it's useful here is because we're in a close third, and we can tell something about the way she thinks. She's someone who thinks in terms of heaven and earth. We'll find out later that she's a religious person, and so that's her language. And so when it says you have to move heaven and earth to get back on, that's almost, we're in her head. We can hear why she's saying that. Let's skip ahead to, skip the next page and go to Junot Diaz's narrative. Junot Diaz, a great writer, won the Pulitzer Prize for the brief wonders life of Oscar Wilde. This story, I just read it recently and absolutely knocked my socks off. Because he is a master of writing at the sentence level. And again, this is going to be a very voicey kind of a piece. But this one's in first person. So we can see how it changes the style of the prose a little. If we skip the third person filter and just go straight into the narrator, the protagonist telling the story. So I'll read this page and then we'll talk about what he's doing here. Nilda was my brother's girlfriend. This is how all these stories begin. She was Dominican from here and had super long hair like those Pentecostal girls and a chest you wouldn't believe. I'm talking world class. Rafa would sneak her down into our basement bedroom after our mother went to bed and do her to whatever was on the radio right then. The two of them had to let me stay because if my mother heard me upstairs on my couch, everybody's ass would have been fried. And since I wasn't about to spend my night out in the bushes, this is how it was. Rafa didn't make no noise, just a low, something that resembled breathing. Nilda was the one. She seemed to be trying to hold back the crying the whole time. It was crazy hearing her like that. The Nilda I'd grown up with was one of the quietest girls you'd ever meet. She let her hair wall away her face and read the New Mutants, and the only time she looked straight at anything was when she looked out a window. But that was before she'd gotten that chest, before that slash of black hair had gone from something to pull on the bust to something to stroke in the dark. The new Nilda wore stretch pants and Iron Maiden shirts. She had already run away from her mother's and ended up at a group home. She'd already slept with Tono and Nestor and little Anthony from Parkwood, older guys. She crashed over at our apartment a lot because she hated her mom's, who was the neighborhood Baraka? Or I don't know my Spanish. In the morning, she slipped out before my mother woke up and found her. Okay, so it's doing a lot here. Nilda was my brother's girlfriend. This is how all these stories begin. Immediately we know we're in first person because of that first person possessive pronoun, my. The third word of the story, my, tells us, all right, we're in the hands of a first person narrator. And then he says, she was Dominican from here and had super long hair, like those Pentecostal girls, and the chest you wouldn't believe. I'm talking world class. It's the use of that from here that I think shows a really confident narrator. Because we get the sense that this is someone telling a story. And I think the temptation for specificity, you're right, is so great that sometimes we violate the realism of how our characters talk. You know, we have this compulsion, or at least I do, in the first sentences I write to say, you know, what my character's age is, what his background is, what his ethnicity is, what color his hair and eyes are, where he grew up, what he does for a job. And because all these things are a part of character. But I would urge you to resist the temptation to throw all that in your first paragraph, because a lot of it can be revealed through the story. And one of the things, or one of the ways we talk about this, is what Sherman Alexie, the great writer, calls skip the door. The theory here, and this is a term from filmmaking, what it means is you don't have to show a character walking up to a door, putting his hand on the doorknob, turning it, opening the door, and going into a room to know that a character is in the room. You can start with an establishing shot. Show the character in the room. The audience is intelligent. They're going to make the connection that someone walked through a door to get there. They're not going to wonder, did someone crawl through the window? Did someone jump down the chimney? Did they teleport Star Trek style? No, you can skip the door, and your audience can understand that they got into the room via door. But the temptation in writing is often to make sure that the audience understands everything. And he skips all that by using these kind of shortcuts. Like he says, Rafa would sneak her down to our basement. Who is Rafa?
Her lover.
His brother, yeah. Does he ever say, Rafa was my brother? No, he doesn't have to. Because in the first sentence he says, Nilda was my brother's girlfriend. He doesn't have to then say, my brother's name is Rafa. Because later he's going to say, Rafa would sneak her down to the basement. Well, we know that if he's in the basement and Rafa's sneaking her down, he must be the brother. We didn't even have to think about that. It just connects for us. So now again, in Junot Díaz's first draft of the story, there probably was a sentence at some point where he said, my brother's name is Rafa. And later he thought, oh, I can cut that sentence. I don't need it because I'm trying to economize. I'm trying to be efficient. I'm trying to make every word matter. So I can cut the sentences that are extraneous. And everything he writes here, because we're in first person, because it's really voicey, he's thinking about how would this narrator talk. All right, this narrator wouldn't give his address. He would say, oh, she's from here, like I'm from here. He would use terms like a chest you wouldn't believe. For sex, he wouldn't say that his brother made love to Nilda. He'd say that he does her. All right, those are the character's words. It doesn't mean that Juno Diaz is endorsing that kind of language or that kind of objectification of women. It means that this character speaks that way. And so, for the sake of realism, again, he is reflecting that language in the character's mouth. He says, this is how it was. Now, another thing that he does really well is his imagery. Concrete details. So I've been telling you to take shortcuts, but here I want to encourage you to go the extra mile, to use some extra language, because he never uses the word shy. He never says, Nilda was shy. Maybe in his first draft he did, but we don't get Nilda was shy. How do we know, though, that she was shy?
Never looked anyone in the face except when she looked out the window.
Yeah, and that's a concrete detail. We can see her. She doesn't look anyone in the face. What else? What else says that she's shy? Kind of geeky, kind of a loner. Yeah.
Sure. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, she would read it.
She's reading New Mutants, which was one of the X-Men spin-offs before there were 20 X-Men comics, and before they stopped making sense. It was a really good comic. I was a dork. I grew up on X-Men and New Mutants. But, so, she's reading New Mutants.
She let her hair wall away her face.
Yeah, isn't that a great description? Wall away her face. So, he even puts that into concrete details. He doesn't say she put up walls, which is one way of saying someone's, a loner. He lets the language and the imagery do it. He lets the hair wall away her face. She doesn't look at anybody. Then we get something completely different. The new Nilda. And what do we get for the new Nilda? What's her imagery?
She's hot.
Okay, yeah, yeah. She wears stretch pants. She wears Iron Maiden shirts. And
Sleeps around.
Yeah, she sleeps around. And again, specificity is what's going to make us believe. So he tells us the name. Tonio, Nestor, little Anthony from Parkwood, older guys. He doesn't have to tell us who these people are. He doesn't have to tell us how he knows these guys or what each one of them is like. It's just enough to say older guys. She's sleeping with older men. And so we get that sense. Okay, she's kind of sleeping around. But my favorite sentence in this whole beginning, before she'd gotten that chest, before that slash of black hair had gone from something to pull on the bus to something to stroke in the dark. Right? Isn't that just beautiful? That sentence is doing so much work. Maybe the first sentence in the first draft of the story was, she used to be a geeky dork that kids used to tease, but now she was really hot and everyone wanted to sleep with her. Okay, that sentence tells us the same thing as this sentence. But isn't it so much more enjoyable, so much more concrete to say that her hair had gone from something to pull to something to stroke? That tells us the same thing, and it does it in a concrete way. It gives us an image. And it shows us how important the hair is going to be to this character. It's the hair that walls her off. It's the hair that later you want to stroke in the dark. And so he's continuing with this sort of extended metaphor of the hair as a character, the hair having this quality that's tied to her shyness or later to, after puberty, to her sexuality. Also, anybody know how to pronounce the Spanish word? Because I'm embarrassing myself. Is it borracha? We don't know. We're all Southerners.
You can roll the R's since it's two in a row.
Borracha. All right. However you pronounce it, one thing I'd like to point out is, unlike Mark Twain, it's kind of fallen out of fashion. Even though I love Huck Finn and I love the adventures of Tom Sawyer, it's really fallen out of fashion to write with that much dialect. If you read a page of Twain, it's hard to read because he represents everything exactly like the way that people spoke in Hannibal, Missouri. And that's just not done now. So a little bit of dialect, in other words, can go a long way. So we know that this character is Dominican, and yet we only get one word in Spanish, and that's enough because the language he's speaking is reflecting the rhythms of his speech. And every once in a while he's going to drop in a Spanish word, but it doesn't have to be every other word. So I bring up a point like that at a conference like this because as a Southerner myself, I'm often tempted to have a lot of ain'ts and a lot of apostrophes at the end of my ends instead of writing out the ing because I know how the words sound when they come out of a person's mouth. But I remind myself, if I'm writing at the sentence level, again, if I'm doing my job, if the dialogue is good, then the reader will hear that drop a G. I don't have to drop the G off of every sentence to reflect that kind of dialogue, that kind of speech pattern. Okay. Any other things people want to point out or questions about this one? Yeah.
Well, according to Google, it doesn't give me pronunciation. It just says that she was like the village drunkard.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So that's what that word.
Well, and that's great too, because then that tells us a little bit about why she became the person she became. Let's skip back to a very different story now. We'll go back one page to Rick Bass's The Hermit Story. This guy's one of my absolute favorite writers. He's so good. He has just a beautiful command of language. And I think what you're going to see here is very different from the first two. So, you know, Diaz is really voicey. Jones is less voicey, but he uses that free and direct discourse to reflect in his voice. Here is an omniscient. No, I'm sorry, this is an omniscient. It's first person.
Could you elaborate on voicey? Because you, I know it's not first person, but I think you mean, I think I'm sensing it means something with the difference is voicey is the first person, but
Oh,
a
sure.
little more elaborate.
Yeah. I guess you have different kinds of first-person narrators. So a voicey narrator is just, you wouldn't find this in like the creative writing textbook and the glossary voicey, but I guess that's just my way of saying it's a character who the way they speak is really tied to who they are. So it's not just their actions in the story that define the character, it's how they talk. So it's someone who may use a lot of jargon or kind of what we call cliches, but it's, you know, they're cliches. It's just their style of talking.
Would you classify it like as a rhythm to their talking? Like
Sure. Yeah, it might be a rhythm, or it might be the expressions they use, their kind of word choice, whether or not they use a lot of profanity. Sure. This story, though, is really different, and the way it begins slowly, but he's using this language here to set up a tone and a mood, and we can talk in a second about what he's doing. Let me just read these first two paragraphs, and you'll see what I mean. This is the Hermit Story. An ice storm following 7 days of snow. The vast fields and drifts of snow turn into sheets of glazed ice that shine and shimmer blue in the moonlight, as if the color is being captured, not by the bending and absorption of light, but by some chemical reaction within the glossy ice. As if the source of all blueness lies somewhere up here in the north, the core of it beneath one of those frozen fields. As if blue is a thing that emerges in some parts of the world from the soil itself after the sun goes down. Blue creeping up fissures and cracks from depths of several hundred feet. Blue working its way up through the gleaming ribs of Anne's buried dogs. Blue trailing like smoke from the dog's empty eye sockets and nostrils. Blue rising as if from deep dug chimneys until it reaches the surface and spreads laterally and becomes entombed or trapped, but still alive and drifting within those moonstruck fields of ice. Blue like a scent, trapped in the ice, waiting for some soft release, some thawing, so that it can continue spreading. It's Thanksgiving. Susan and I are over at Ann and Roger's house for dinner. So, really different narrator here. Just looking at those first paragraphs, ice, snow, drifts of snow, sheets of ice, glossy ice, blueness, north, frozen fields, blue, 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 moonstruck fields of ice, blue ice. Right? All of those references to ice and blueness and frozenness in 2 paragraphs. Why? Maybe for some readers it's overkill. For me, it's not. Why all this emphasis? Why this repetition?
Well, I think that he has this sensation of, when we think of snow and ice as white, but he sees it in blue, so now he's trying to show how this blue permeated his entire sensory perception.
It's a psychological tone.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, he's driving the tone with this. When you think of blue, it's sad, ice is cold, and you think, you know, ice, snow, you're kind of lonely, I guess, but it's not like that. Snow, tundra, really.
But even more so, blue is alive. It's a character. It has become almost like a person.
Yeah, and I would say by the end of the story, the landscape is a character in the story. There's the narrator and Roger and the narrator's wife Susan, but the landscape becomes a character as we move through the story. And so these first two paragraphs tell us how important this imagery of frozen fields is going to be, because they're going to wind up at the end of the story out in these fields, out stuck in the snow and trapped. And we even get a foreshadowing of that, because we get that blue like a scent trapped in the ice, and later they're going to become trapped. And speaking of skipping the door, okay, after we get this beautiful lush description, he says just point blank, it's Thanksgiving, Susan and I are over at Ann and Roger's house for dinner. I mean, think about all the doors we skip. We don't have the couple getting ready for Thanksgiving. We don't have the invitation. We don't know what year it is. It doesn't matter for the purpose of the story. We don't know who these characters are, or why they're over there for dinner, or how good of friends they are. It doesn't matter. He's skipping all that stuff. We don't set the table. We don't have the blessing. It's Thanksgiving. We're here for dinner. And then the very next sentence, the storm has knocked out all the power. Because for the purpose of this story, none of that matters, so we're skipping all of it and moving ahead. And I don't want to run out of time, so we're going to move to the last example, and then we're going to talk about some other tricks for guiding the sense over here. This is from Brownies by Z.Z. Packer. She's from Louisville, Southern writer, and fantastic first book. We're still waiting 8 years later for her novel, but her collection's called Drinking Coffee Elsewhere. Has anybody had a chance to read this? Yeah, great collection. This is one of the best stories, and it's called Brownies. So talking about, we're talking about Boise, I think you'll get a sense of what I mean from the first sentence of the story. By our second day at Camp Crescendo, the girls in my Brownie troop had decided to kick the asses of each and every girl in Brownie Troop 909. Troop 909 was doomed from the first day of camp. They were white girls, their complexions a blend of ice cream, strawberry, vanilla. So we skipped the door. What do we know about the narrator of the story?
She's a black brownie.
Yeah, we know that this is a troop of African American girls. We know they're not white because they're talking about how the other troop is those white girls. So she doesn't have to say she's black. We know that she's not white, and we know that there's an animosity here between them, because she talks about how their complexions are a blend of ice cream, okay, actually that's not a very good example. The animosity is going to come in later. I guess strawberry and vanilla aren't really negative terms. And the next sentence says, they turtled out from their bus. All right, we're talking about active verbs versus weak verbs. Turtle, do we see this? Do we see the image? You know, it's that idea of you duck under the door of the bus and you come out the way, you know, turtle. I'm sure that when she wrote the first draft of the story, she said that they ducked out of the bus, or they poked their heads out of the bus. And that's fine for a first draft. But as she revised, I'm sure she came up with that word turtle, and it is. It's the perfect word. And so when I talk a little later about adverbs and why we don't need them, the reason is because if you get a verb like turtle, it tells you everything that you need to know without saying, you know, they ducked their heads like a turtle. Okay, and it goes on, and then we're going to skip a little bit to the paragraph that begins with our meta. I want to look at this paragraph because this is a great example of that concrete imagery that we were talking about. Arnetta said this from the very rear of the line, far away from Mrs. Margolin, who always strung our troop behind her like a brood of obedient ducklings. Mrs. Margolin even looked like a mother duck. She had hair cropped close to a small ball of a head, almost no neck, and huge, miraculous breasts. She wore enormous belts that looked like the kind that weightlifters wear, except hers would be cheap metallic gold or rabbit fur, or covered with gigantic fake sunflowers. And often these belts would become nature lessons in and of themselves. See, Miss Margolin once said to us, pointing to her belt, this one's made entirely from the feathers of baby pigeons. So, Ezra Pound the poet had this famous phrase, which was, make it new. And I think here Packer's doing a great job of that. Because you can describe a person by their eye color or their demeanor or what they're wearing. This woman is described almost entirely by her belts. And that's just a really unusual way to describe a character. And for me, it's new. I haven't seen much of that. And then she not only has these belts that Packer describes as being like the kind weightlifters wear, which tells us they're huge, but then it's also one that's made of baby pigeon feathers. And how does one get baby pigeon? Who would slaughter baby pigeons? It's very disturbing. And she says it, very matter-of-factly or almost proudly. So there's humor here. There's lush description, and it's a new way of looking at a description of a character. So you're welcome to keep these packets. They're just great little examples, I think, of some fine writing. But let's go into a long list here of, now that we've seen some concrete examples, I want to give you my thoughts on some tricks for as you revise. I won't say write. In fact, I should probably have called this whole session revising your story to some level. And again, there are no hard and fast rules here. So I would say that as soon as I say this is the way to do it, you'll probably be able to think of 2 or 3 examples of how someone's broken that rule and done it better, and that's good. Feel free to stop me and argue at any time if you disagree, because again, these are just my opinions, but they've served me well and a lot of my writer friends well, and I think that they'll serve you well too. So the first one that we talked about, skip the door, which is really just shorthand for avoid any situation where you can establish a shot in a much more quick and useful way, economical way. So don't show the character with their hand on the doorknob, just show them in the room and you'll understand they had to open the door to get there. Sentence length. Sentence length has a lot to do with the tone or emotion that you're trying to set up in a story. So if you think about, it's popular to talk about what was the shortest sentence in the Bible.
Jesus wept.
Exactly, Jesus wept. And that's really powerful. Because we could have had this long, elaborate, the tears flowed out of his eyes and down his cheeks and they dropped down his chin and pooled into his hand, this sort of long, descriptive passage. But sometimes shorter is better. And so just that Jesus wept is devastating in the context it's in. And so think about that. When you've got a really long sentence, think, would this sentence be more useful as a long sentence, as a short sentence, as kind of an in-between? Can I break up a couple sentences? How is that going to affect the tone or the mood of emotion of what I'm trying to go for in this section? Dialogue. All right, a couple sub-points for dialogue. One is that you should probably use it sparingly. If you notice in what I gave you here, there's not a lot of dialogue. Often dialogue is, we write a lot of dialogue because we watch a lot of TV and movies. And I'm not accusing anyone, I'm accusing myself. I watch way too much TV. I watch way too many movies when I should be reading. Because I like it, because it's fun. There's actually a lot of good movies out. But what it often does is it trains us to think like a screenwriter instead of like a story writer. And screenwriters write dialogue. If you've ever written or read a screenplay, it's nothing like watching the movie because it's mostly just shots and dialogue. So if you're trained in that sort of, if versed in that world of how characters speak to each other, then you're going to be writing all this extraneous dialogue you don't need. Because really, you can cut whole sections of that dialogue by the shorthand of summary. So, for example, the story that I'll be teaching in the class tomorrow is a story about a woman who goes to see a friend that she hasn't seen in 12 years and finds out that in that time, he's had a son, and the son has cystic fibrosis, and he's just telling her this for the first time. So he tells her that the son has cystic fibrosis, and then the narrator says, he told me the whole story from beginning to end. That's awful, I said. And we get the sense that she got the whole story. If we were to get in dialogue the whole story of how he married his wife, how then they discovered their chromosome abnormalities, and when it was first diagnosed, that could take pages, and we don't actually need it because it's a short story. Maybe in a novel we can flesh it out, but for the purposes of a story, we don't need it. So always think about where you've got, if you have more than 5, 6 sentences of dialogue in a row, think about where could I trim 3 or 4 of these sentences and just have the narrator, whether it's first person, third person, close, or limited, where could I have this narrator just summarizing for me instead of having this dialogue go on and on. Another subpoint with dialogue is the tags. And I'm going to argue what Stephen King argues in his memoir on writing, even though he doesn't follow it, which is that said is the best dialogue tag. You rarely need anything else. So often when I was an editor, I would read 300 and 400 stories a month that would come into the Chattahoochee Review, and there would be these sentences like, yes, I commanded her. No, he bellowed. Please stop, she said beseechingly. And it was like these sentences that you cringe because it's like, oh, if the person would put the right dialogue in the context, you wouldn't need those tags. If someone's angry, and you've shown in the scene that they're angry and their dialogue has that venom in it, then you usually don't have to say, he shouted. I mean, occasionally, if you really want to provide emphasis, you might say that someone bellowed or shouted, or that someone whispered, if you're having a really hard time conveying it in the language. But often, using another tag just means that you haven't done your work as a writer. You haven't made the dialogue reflect what's going on. And so, I say just use said as often as possible.
Well, the example you just gave sounded more like a screenwriter trying to give commands to actors instead of writing
Yeah. Yeah, and it works for playwrights and for screenwriters because they have to be telling the actors what the scene is. But as a writer, writing for readers, your reader should already know what's going on in the scene and how your character feels. And if you're doing your work and the dialogue is working, they should get the sense of what the tone is behind that setting. And so, on the one hand, people might say, oh, if you say said, it becomes redundant. That's the whole point. It does become redundant, and then it melts away. If you ever read Carver, Raymond Carver, one of my favorite short story writers, I mean, tons of sets. Like, I think I counted up, and he's got this one story, everything stuck to him. I think there's like 200 sets. But you kind of move into this trance, because after the 20th, 21st set, it just sort of melts away on the page, and really what you're just reading is the dialogue. And the dialogue is so strong that it's doing the work. I'm not saying never use he shouted, she whispered. Just make sure that you're using them sparingly. Otherwise, they can become really, really distracting. Also, watch out for what I would call Dr. Phil dialogue. Okay. I don't watch a lot of Dr. Phil. When I do, what drives me crazy isn't the way he talks. He's supposed to talk that way. He's a therapist, right? Maybe he's a therapist. I'm not sure what he is. But he's supposed to be a therapist. What kills me is the way that people very quickly adopt his speech, and instead of speaking concretely about what's bothering them, they're probably subconsciously mimicking the way that they think that they're supposed to talk about their situations. And this carries over even to shows like The Hills, who, God bless her, my wife cannot stop watching, I don't understand it. But you've got these young teenagers, and they're speaking like they're all in therapy. They're using these terms, I'm just having a really difficult emotional time right now, and I'm going through some things, and it's all these abstract things, like, well, what things are you going through? It's like, well, I can't get in touch with my inner self. No, people don't talk of that way. 20 years ago, people didn't talk about their inner selves. And so we're the most over-psychologized country in the world. And I have nothing against psychology, and I think definitely, psychology can really help people. I just think I don't want to read it in my fiction. I don't want my characters to be talking about their wounded inner child. I want them to be talking about the belt and where it hit them when their father was angry. I don't want them to talk about, I don't want them to use the word abuse. I want to see the belt. Does that make sense? Is it the difference? Yeah, so when you are using dialogue, don't have a character say, my father abused me. Have a character say, my father hit me, because abuse is a word from psychology. It's not a word that characters in good fiction would use, unless maybe your character is a psychiatrist, all right, in which case, have fun with that story. Prepositions. What are we on? 4? I'm just making this up so I go along. Prepositions. This drives me crazy. The character stood up. Is there any other way? All right, so watch out whenever you've got a preposition like that. Think about where you can cut words. Again, we're trying to economize our language. So a character can stand. They don't have to stand up. Adverbs. All right, I promised we would talk about adverbs. So if we're just writing our first draft, we may say that she moved quickly from the room. Okay, we want to economize. So how else could we put this in one word?
Darted.
Good. Darted. She darted from the room. If we really want to exaggerate, we could say she flew from the room. She hurried from the room. Each of these have different connotations. Flew is definitely our more exaggerated one. Darted, sort of, for me, it suggests like going at some sort of an angle. Hurried, kind of like, what else?
Hurdled.
She escaped the room. Yeah, if she's in danger, that would be a great verb. She escaped the room. Another exaggerated one, she hurtled from the room. All right, so all of these are better than she moved quickly, because all of these are synonyms for moved, but they're words that are showing how she moved, instead of saying she moved quickly, because all of these imply quickness in the verb itself. So you see how a strong verb, like darted, that tells us that you're moving and that tells us you're moving quickly is better than having that sort of lugubrious sensation moved quickly. Does that make sense? So there's nothing wrong with adverbs in and of themselves. I just think that often you can use a shortcut, and that's by using one word instead of attacking an adverb onto another word. All right. Another thing to watch out for, I see this a lot in my students' fiction and when I edited fiction, is what I would call memory triggers. Again, this isn't a term you're going to find in a glossary in the back of my fiction writing book. It's just something that I could call them. A memory trigger is when you have a character who needs to move from present to past tense. And we do this a lot in my writing. We'll be talking about a situation and we have to go from them into the past tense. And a lot of writers feel, at least I felt when I was first starting out, that I had to find a door or some gateway into that past. So, you might have a character who's going to see his friend at a bar. And part of this story is about the fact that these guys grew up together and that they have a history. And so you might have that character sort of look at his watch. And then you might use that watch as a gateway to say, I remember when he got that watch. We were 13 years old growing up in Brooklyn together. And then you launch into the past. What I would argue is that you don't need those memory triggers, that it looks much more confident, it's much more efficient to just have him walk into the bar, see his friend, and say, we grew up together. we grew up in Brooklyn. You don't have to focus in on something. You don't have to use that memory trigger to get there. Just have the character say it. This is who this person is. This is how I know him or her. Similarly, along these same lines are sensory filters. Oftentimes they say sentences like, he saw her hit the softball, or he heard the train coming down the tracks. We don't need those filters at the beginning, because if you're in a character's point of view and it says the train was coming down the tracks, we know he heard it. If we say she hit the softball, if he's watching the softball game, we know he saw it. All right, so these ticks and these little twitches that come out in our first drafts because we don't trust the reader, you have to learn to eliminate them when you revise the story. It's just like skipping the door. You know that if you describe something and you're in a first or post third person point of view, that that's what they're seeing. You don't have to stop and tell us, okay, he's seeing this character do this. Gerunds. All right, I would say ver gerunds. Those verbs that end in ing. So instead of giving us a sentence like, I was running, what can we say? I ran, yeah. If you're in past tense, stay, whenever possible, in the simple past tense. I ran. I was running. You know, occasionally, gerunds will serve you well if you're trying to draw something out. If you're trying to make it last longer, then that can work well. But if you're just trying to economize your language, I would say stick with the simple past whenever possible. All right, I'm running out of space again. Okay. Along with these sort of filters and triggers, we also have what I would call preambles. Some of these popular preambles are things like, needless to say, all right, if needless to say, just say it. You don't have to use it. That's the it came as no surprise that, okay, well, and just state it. Now, of course, if it's a voicey piece, if you have a folksy character who speaks this way, then yeah, I mean, you may have some long sentences that kind of ramble on, and that might be intended for humor or just to reflect that this is the character's way of thinking and speaking. But generally, you can cut out a lot of these things that begin our sentences. And I think when we write, we sort of have these tics because often until we've composed the sentence, we don't quite know where the sentence is going. And so we write a lot of words to try to figure out where we're going. It's kind of a stalling mechanism, and it's in revision that we can cut them out. Watch out, again, for cliches. Great writer John Dufresne, Louisiana Power and Light, said his least favorite phrase in student writing is filled the air. Sound filled the air, chaos filled the air, sadness filled the air. Nothing fills the air but air. If everybody's sad, then you need to describe to us, what are those characters doing? Are they crying? Are they all quiet? Are they twiddling their hands in their laps? Is it a melancholy? Is it a deep sorrow? Is it a funeral? Is it watching tragic events unfold on the news? The moment is going to tell us how to read the sadness. If you're just sort of making a sweeping gesture that sadness filled the air, it's because you haven't done the work of showing us what's going on and explaining to us how the characters feel. So watch out, as much as I'm telling you to skip doors and use shortcuts, watch out for those kind of shortcuts that don't add anything concretely to the story, that are just sort of vague, unspecific things that don't mean anything. watch out for the word it. Speaking of vague things, this pronoun it is something that's, that pops up a lot because you don't want to keep renaming the noun. And so, sometimes it's okay, but often I'll read through a story and there's just it's everywhere. And another thing that drives me crazy is it's and it's. All right, which one is possessive? First one, right? Okay, this is possessive. This is the contraction for it is. Now I know every other word in the English language is possessive, has an apostrophe, but in this case it doesn't. So just watch that. That's not really. That's more of just a grammar proofreading thing. That's not really about typing your prose. It's just the kind of thing that may signal to an editor that you're an amateur, or you don't know the language well enough. While we're talking about editors, just for the sake of publishing, some things to know. When you do send your work out, whether it's a novel manuscript to an agent, whether it's a story manuscript to a literary magazine, always make sure that your stories are typed, and that they're double spaced. Whether you write in longhand or type your first drafts doesn't matter. Whether you like to write double spaced or single spaced doesn't matter. I'm just talking about the final draft you actually send out. It should be typed, double spaced. It should be 12-point font, and it should be a standard font like Times New Roman. All right, nothing too fancy. Make sure that you have 1 to 1.5 inch margins all the way around. Other than that, a lot of times people ask me, well, what are the other tricks of the format? Should it be stapled? Should it be paper clipped? It doesn't really matter. As long as it looks professional. White paper, I've seen weird things. As long as it looks professional, it's going to get a read.
Should you always send a query letter with your manuscript when you send it to the publisher?
Oh, yeah, I would definitely query, if you're sending out a novel or a memoir or something, yeah, I would query agents before I just sent them the book. Yeah, so you'll want to send out a query letter talking about what the book is about, and then when they ask for the manuscript or the first 50 pages of the manuscript, that's when you send it. For stories, for magazines, no, just send the story. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about publishing in just a second. And I will leave about 10 minutes here. Yeah, I've got 15 minutes. I'll make sure I leave 10 minutes for questions. Okay, just a few more things. In terms of writing at sentence level, since that's what we're here for, if you really want to emphasize in dialogue or in speech, it's okay to italicize. Okay, we can use italicis, slant the letters to show sarcasm, to show that sort of hissing kind of anger, to show humor. What you don't want to do is, in speech, use all caps. Okay, if you really want someone to be screaming at someone, then use an exclamation point. But all caps is something we do in email. It's not something that we want to do in fiction. Also, one exclamation point is always enough. Okay, you don't need multiple ones to show that they're really, really angry. Again, if the dialogue is doing the work, we should be able to infer that from the words that the speaker has given us. Also, be careful of be careful of the verb to be. I mean, it's something that we all have to use, but again, strong verbs, weak verbs. If you have a lot of to be in your story, then think about ways you can revise that to make it more interesting for the reader. Again, reading should be fun for the reader, not just because they're enjoying the plot or the story or they're interested in the character, it's because they should be enjoying the language. And so you want each sentence to really sing and your story to stand out. Okay, last one. Point 15. This is kind of like the its and its. I'm sure everybody has their little pet peeves. This one is one of mine. And this is another thing that's going to stand out to editors that might set you apart from an amateur and professional writer. Farther and further. Can you tell me the difference?
Farther's distance and further means more.
Yeah. So if you're talking about actual physical distance, you use farther. Those water bottles are farther from me than this podium. But I'm going to use the word further. I would say that I have further to go in my career as a writer, all right? Because I'm not actually physically moving in that sense. All right, I think that covers some little tips and things to watch out for when you're writing your own stories. So I know that that's a ton of information, a lot of examples, and a lot of nitpicky, gritty stuff. Not the holistic stuff, but the sentence level stuff. And if you saw the introduction this morning, she was talking about different kinds of editors. There are those editors who are big picture editors, and there are those editors who are line editors. And I think in a perfect world, you should be both for yourself. Write the story, make sure that the story is working on a big picture level, that the story makes sense, that the characters' actions make sense, that you can enjoy reading the story. Once you have the story working on a narrative level, then you have to really do the line editing, because the line editing is what is going to get the story published. It's going to make people want to read you and remember your stories. It's that specificity. It's when every word matters. It's when you economize the language. It's when you can have the reader read your story and say, there's not a word out of place. There's not a sentence that I can take out. I think that a story should be so tight that it's kind of stacked like those pickup sticks, where if you pull out one line, the whole thing kind of collapses. Because otherwise, if you can pull out a line and the story's fine, then pull that sentence out. You know, feel free when your story's done to cut it down by 10, 20, 30%. That's been one of my best experiences as a writer. I had a magazine accept a story, and we got it all finished, and it was perfect and beautiful, and I was just in love with it, and this editor helped me, and it was great, and it was done, and it was in the bag, and then 10 days before publication, the editor calls me up and said, well, we got some news from the people that are higher up above me. She was just the fiction editor. We need to cut 1,200 words from your story. I said, why? Well, they had to sell another page of advertising. Okay. So completely out of both of our control. It's an 8,000 word story, so I'm going to have to cut basically 1/8 of the story. And I thought, how can I do this? We already had the story perfect. And she said, well, we'll do it 2 ways. You do your version, I'll do my version, we'll see what we like better. In the end, it wound up being a combination of she found some stuff to cut, I found other stuff to cut. In the end, though, when I showed it to a bunch of friends, they couldn't tell the difference. They were like, well, it's all still here. It's the same story. You didn't lose any characters. You didn't have to saw off any limbs. You didn't have to drop out any plot points. You didn't have to unravel any threads. It was 1,200 words of just sort of deadwood language that was sprinkled throughout the story that I could pull out or make more efficient. And the story wound up becoming even stronger than I thought it could be. So I would challenge you to do that. Even when you think a story's done, and you have it perfect on the sentence level, you can probably always cut out another 10 or 20%. I'm not saying to be Gordon Lish, all right? If you know the whole Lish-Carver situation, you know that he ripped out 60 to 80% of all of Carver's stories, and some of them suffered for it, and some of them were better for it. But most stories, you could easily trim 10% out, and the story's the same. It's just as good. It just reads more fluidly, more evenly, more efficiently on the page. So all that having been said, we have about 8 more minutes. I am more than happy to open it up to discussion questions.
You mentioned having an editor. You let your friends read it. Probably your wife read it and so forth. Do you get an editor to read it and work with you before you send it to you send it to someone that you want to publish it? No. Or do you wait for them to give you an editor?
Yeah, generally wait for them. I mean, I have my first reader, which is my wife, and then a second reader who's someone who's another writer who I really trust. And then there's a group of us. I have a lot of friends, and so I may look at a story and say, okay, well, this is really up Kara's alley, or This is really more Christian's kind of style. So I'll show it to 2 or 3 people who I think will get the story, because when you have someone look at your work, you want them to look at it on that story's terms. So if I have a story that's like magic realism, I may not show it to someone who only likes reading John Updike. Or if I have a story that's realism, I'm not going to show it to my friends who read sci-fi. So I try to match the story with the type of reader and then get their best input. I don't think I've ever sent a story out without getting at least 3 or 4 people's input, because I know that we all have blinders on. We can only see our own strengths, and often we miss again and again our own weaknesses. So I think that's what MFA programs are for. That's what writing workshops are for. That's just even writing groups are for. Anytime you can surround yourself with 3, 4, 10 people to help you look at your work and see your own weaknesses, it really helps. And then once you're happy with it, then send it out. And the editor who accepts it will then suggest his or her changes. But I've never worked with or paid someone to edit before I've sent it out.
Well, I had a publisher ask me to do it, and I had an editor after I completed the book, and I had to cut half of it out. So I know what you're talking about. And then the copy editor, that's the one that, how it looks on the page, right? The copy editor was harder, I think, than the editor. What if you have an unsympathetic editor?
I mean, it's happened to me before. I had one story accepted where the editor, after this editor accepted it, she wanted me to make changes that I thought so changed the story I wouldn't want to see it published that way. At which point I had to say, I love your magazine, I want to be in it, but and I know that often my stuff needs help, and I'm always happy to accept the advice of other editors, but in this case, I just don't like the story anymore, so we can either do it my way or I'd rather take it somewhere else. And she said, okay, she said, we'll do it your way. And in that case, it worked out for the best. But if she hadn't, which would have been her right, it's her magazine, and she said, well, this is the only way I like the story, I would have said, okay, and happily take it to another place. So, yeah, I don't think you should, I mean, if it's the New Yorker, do whatever they want, but but in most cases, if you no longer like the story, if you make such huge changes that it's not the story it was, then if it was good enough to get in there, it'll probably get in somewhere else. Yeah.
How many of your 15 points apply to nonfiction?
Oh, I think all of them. I really do, yeah.
This isn't written just for narratives, for novels.
Yeah, I think I'm just talking basic points of craft here, and I think poetry is going to be very different. But in terms of whether you're writing creative nonfiction, memoir, or biography, whatever, I think fiction, nonfiction, you're still telling a story. You're still giving the reader a narrative, and so the same rules apply.
Well, I would say that even with poetry, most of what you said is going to apply because you're trying to create the most amount of impact with the least amount of words.
Yeah, that's really well put. So yes, in poetry also. I've taught you everything. All genres.
Stories from the same book?
These are actually, yes, these all came from Lex Williford and Michael Martone edited the Scrivener Anthology of Contemporary Short Stories. This is from the 2nd edition. It's published by Touchstone Books. You can probably find it in any bookstore. Yeah.
I think I read an interview with you that said that you learned your writing from attempting to write a first novel. That is where you actually thought you learned to write. But it seems like I don't know, were you writing another novel, attempting to write another novel, or are you pretty much stuck on the short story market? That's where your comfort zone is right now.
I just can't believe there's even an interview out there with me. Who am I? I'm nobody you've ever heard of. But thank you. Yeah, I'm actually writing a novel. I've had 2 or 3 unsuccessful stabs at novels. So I wrote stories for a long time, and after 6 years of doing really well with stories, I finally had a collection. And my agent tried to sell the collection, and we had a couple of houses that were really interested. And they said what most houses say when you sell them a collection, which is great, where's the novel? because collections don't sell well in the stores, novels do, and so often a publishing house will give you a 2-book deal. They'll say, well, we'll be willing to publish your short story collection if you have a saleable novel. And so right now I'm writing the novel to try to sell the collection, which sounds bad because even though I started it that way, within 6 weeks, now I'm really into it. I'm a couple hundred pages in, I'm enjoying it, and I love novel writing as much as story writing. But yeah, I think you learn to write 2 ways. One is by reading, read as much as you can of the writers you like and try to imitate them and steal from them. And the other is bad writing. Unless you're a lot smarter than me, it's going to take years. I think Larry Brown said it took 8 years of writing about 8 hours a day before he finished the first book that got published. It's practice. Practice makes perfect. So don't be afraid if the first novel or the first stories are bad. It probably will be. Just don't give up. I have thousands of pages of bad prose for the few hundred good ones.
Can you ever stretch a short story into a novel? I know you have to add a lot, but is that possible?
Yeah. Scarlet Letter started as a story. Brock Clark's new novel, great novel from Algonquin called Arsonist's Guide to Writers' Homes in New England, started as a short story in one of his collection. Yeah, it could definitely be done, but I would say it probably is a challenge.
Depends on the choice.
Yeah. Maybe 1 or 2 others, yes?
Well, when you were reading what you read of the Ruth story, I was almost cutting, where you do the lines of poetry, because it was so lyrical and poetic. And then when I saw like it's Thanksgiving, just that one sentence, knowing, well, this is over. That the blue, even though I haven't read the story, I knew that the blue and even the different meanings of the word blue, like in the first paragraph, it starts out almost like a lumber, and then it goes into this, kind of a scary, almost scary, frightening thing, so that you know that at the end, that's going to be important. And one of my first poetry professors told us, don't write about love. None of you. I don't ever want you guys to write about love because your poems will suck. Well, thinking later on that, I realized what he was saying. We're not going to be able to write about anything that these, love, all the emotions, hate, anything. But what it taught me was we got to it because we wanted to avoid love. We got to it in circuitous routes, into a window, into the back door, so that we weren't we weren't hitting people with a love poem, but because you can't avoid these emotions because they're a part of us, and that's what people write about. But we learned how to do it without hitting people in the face. Because if we had tried to write a love poem, it would have sucked.
Yeah.
So I kind of get that conciseness of, and he also said, get in there and get out, which,
Yeah, and that's another great point. I should have said along with skipping the doors, get into any scene as late as you can and get out of any scene as early as you can. Write the scene, but then trim it on either end as far as you can in either direction. A great film I just saw. Has anybody seen the movie Jack Goes Boating? Philip Seymour Hoffman's first directed film. It is a great literary kind of film, and it's the best example I've seen of getting into a scene really late and getting out really early. And also great, we were talking about plot earlier, just roadblocks. It's just a guy who wants to take a girl out on a date, and it's all the roadblocks for him to try to get to the point where he can take her on this day out on the lake to go boating. Really perfect movie.
Is the Hermit story, is the author trying to isolate these characters into a certain area? Is that what he's doing?
Oh yeah, definitely. They're trapped.
I know you said that, but like the front part is to like closing that world closer and closer. Is that what he's doing?
Yeah, I think so. That he's using the language to kind of trap you into the ice and set the tone for that trap. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your attention. And enjoy the rest of your